Hello. In this lecture, we'll look at Primitivism and Cubism, and then separately at Futurism and Dada. These are two of the modernist movements from the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Modernism is an umbrella style or category that connects or encompasses several styles. Um, Things were changing so rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century that artists were responding to what was happening and moving into um, a new, more experimental phase of art and culture in a way that hadn't happened previously. Modernism was a very dynamic movement in culture, and as such, things were changing so rapidly that um, styles were and struggling to kind of keep up, and artists were wanting to really focus on the new, and that was what was most important about modernism is that they were trying to make an art and a culture that really reflected new ideas at the dawn of this new century, and that was a really big deal for what was happening during the time. Also, what we see is the influence of post-impressionism on art and culture. The freedom that artists felt to make these decisions, to do things that in previous generations would not have been acceptable. But now artists are freed from the connection to the patron, such a strong connection to the patron, and they really use that freedom to explore um, art for its own sake, art that doesn't really just reflect the styles and tastes of the wealthy and the elite. Now we're going to look at these um, two styles independently, but they also connect. Cubism refers to a very specific technique that was the result of a more primitivist approach. So these are two connected styles. Very often the terms can be kind of applied interchangeably. Not all primitivists are cubists, and not all cubists work primitively, but they're connected for sure. Now, the most important element of that connection is the idea of this dismissal of illusion. So, painting for the 400 years, 500 years prior to uh, the beginning of the 20th century had been all about the illusion of depth and reality in a work. So the idea was to make it look more realistic by using techniques that would fuel that illusion. The primitivists are going to dismiss that. They're going to say that a painting is a painting. It doesn't have to be more than it is. It doesn't have to be an illusion of the reality of life. And instead, they're going to focus on the formal elements of a work. So the lines, the marks, the shapes that those lines create, the planes that those shapes build up and create. And so those basic fundamental building blocks of an image are what they're going to focus on rather than having that add up to something else. And so they're still going to use subject matter that's recognizable from the real world very often. Not completely always, but most of the time we will see a recognizable subject. But the goal is not to create something that renders that subject in a believable or realistic way. It is a pure abstraction. Now, um, the goal is ultimately to analyze the object in space and then synthesize that on the canvas or on the surface. Or, if it's a sculpture, to synthesize its form in the sculpted form. So you're using the analysis of the object to, instead of see the object as a form, only as what it is, but to break a figure down into its fundamental forms or shapes, to break a still life or a landscape down into its shapes, and create something that is more abstract in that. Now, one of the leaders, early leaders of the movement, is Pablo Picasso. Picasso is famous not only for his um, innovation in the early 20th century and leadership in that, but for his longevity. He goes through, during his long career, many phases and is party to many different stylistic movements. But he doesn't invent Cubism. He's one of this group, and in fact, the the true innovator, I suppose, would have to be Georges Braque. But Picasso is heavily influenced. They're friends, and he sees what Braque is doing, and he borrows from that. So Picasso and Braque are both kind of the co-leaders of this Cubist movement. And then in terms of sculpture, the leading sculptor of the movement would be Jacques Lipchitz. Now, this is one of Picasso's most famous Cubist works. It's called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Women of Avignon. And in it we see Picasso take the form of these figures and pare them down and distill them to kind of their simplest shape elements and simplest line elements. And in so doing, what he's trying to accomplish is to create a work that we recognize the subject, but that it's not tied so strongly to the subject. The painting just becomes a painting, and these lines and shapes are simply what they are. It's not trying to be something other than it is. And I think what's really interesting about Picasso's style and work from this time is how he is taking things that he sees, things that he's experiencing visually, artistically, things that he sees in his, in other artist studios, things that he sees on display in exhibitions, and he's borrowing from them and adding them to his own works. The two figures on the right in particular show the direct influence of one such experience. He writes about and talks about going to see an exhibition on display in Paris of African masks, cultural masks. And he then goes back to his studio and he paints these figures, and their faces become stylized versions of these masks, these wooden masks that he saw in this exhibition. And I think that's really ultimately what the modernist movement is about. It's about seeing the artist not so much just as a renderer of the natural, just copying what's happening in nature, but also the stylization that the artist uses. That's really ultimately what defines the artist, is their style, their own sense of right and wrong and beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. And I think that Picasso really embodies that in his style. The figures become these flattened shapes. They become outlines. They become lines. They become planes. And in that, we don't see them as figures any longer. We don't see them as believable in space, and that's not at all the goal. Now, as Picasso explored the range of experience, he went from very primitive, meaning primitive not in the sense of less civilized, but primitive in the sense of more naive or more pure, more focused on the unconscious. And as he experimented with that idea, this idea of direct image making, he created images that are not purely abstract, that they do approach a level of stylized realism, but they're clearly abstracted. I mean, the way that he uses color, the way that he uses shape, the way that he uses texture and patterning, all of those things are purely his own. He's not copying or borrowing from the traditions of art, and he's not hiding his brushstrokes, and he's not, he's not using the techniques that artists over the previous centuries had developed. Instead, he's focusing just on what he sees as his own style. And, for Picasso, he's also, in terms of his subject matter, he's reflecting what he sees in Parisian culture, Parisian life, and that's an important part of his own style, is he sees his work as a mirror, as a reflection of what's happening in society. Now, as his own version of Cubism evolves over time, what happens is that it becomes a little bit more analytical, a little bit more geometric, a little bit less raw and primitive, and he eventually moves out of Cubism and into a new, more stylistic phase, a more abstract phase, the later into his career he gets. But at this point, he's still a relatively young artist, and he's trying to figure out where that boundary between enough of a shape, a line, a figure, and when is it enough to give the viewer so that you recognize what the subject is. Here he calls this three musicians, and he's painting basically street musicians, but they are so heavily stylized, so abstracted that it really does cause the viewer to question: is this enough? Do I see enough to understand these forms? And I think that ultimately that's what Cubism is about. It's about trying to figure out the boundaries and figure out the balance between stylization and abstraction and realization and subject matter. Because, we're so used to seeing our images and reading them based upon what the subject is. But when there's not that strong tie to that subject, or the tie is not as important, then where does the viewer go? How do we read and interpret that? And that's an important question that's being asked by the modernists. Now, Georges Braque, his version of Cubism is slightly different, and he's taking a more tonal approach versus just flat planes of color. We'll see a variety of tones and textures in Braque's work, but there's still this breaking down of the picture plane into shapes and lines and flattening of that plane. Braque is also, again, borrowing from things that he sees, pop culture. He borrows from advertising, he borrows from lettering and graphic design and poster making, and the things that he's seeing and the techniques that are common in his time. They're trying to make an art that is very much of their own time, and I think that that's very important to what's happening for the Cubists, for the modernists. Now, when we look at Braque's work, you see lines that kind of are reminiscent of a subject, but his work is a little less connected to the subject. So he takes a still life, for instance, here, of a candle and a violin, and it's so deconstructed, it's so broken, that we don't read it as those objects necessarily. It's just there's a few sort of random connections in terms of shape and line, but he wants it to be something else. And that's ultimately the question that they're dealing with is, can art be something other than just mimicry, just rendering something that already exists in life? And if it can, which of course is their contention that it can, then what's the role of the artist in that? Is it to really create the style, or is it to create the subject, or is it to create both? Is it to, how does the artist then make something that is purely their own? If they can create something that's new and purely theirs, and still, be part of the traditions of art, still make imagery that's pleasing to the eye, that's going to show viewers something that not only that they care to see, but that they find attractive. Now, in sculpture, this is a little bit different because a sculpture has to exist in the world, and it has to follow the laws of physics and form. And so for the sculptor, the rules are a little different, the challenge is a little different, but breaking a figure down, breaking an object down into its fundamental, more geometric, solid forms, that's what Lipschitz is trying to do here. He wants to take this figure and simplify it and abstract it to the point where we recognize it, but ultimately we know that it's clearly been stylized. And that's what Lipschitz does. He wants to explore how far he can take that figure. How long, where's that boundary? How far can he go and only give us a piece or a form, or take those forms and rearrange them, or take those forms and make them a little less recognizable? And can we still read it as a figure? Now, a movement that's developing kind of simultaneously, but just slightly after, is Futurism and Dada, and it's sort of connected. It's still modernism. It's still part of this umbrella, but it is a slightly different take on things. The Futurists really, they rise more in Southern Europe, in Italy, in Spain a little bit, and then ultimately coming to Paris and working in Paris. But they're looking at time, they're looking at movement, they're looking at trying to capture that in a in a single image. They're inspired by what's happening with the development of moving pictures, the development of movies, also the development of photography in a different form, because photography is making some very, very rapid technological developments in the early 20th century. And so they're inspired by all of these things. And so the futurists, like Giacomo Balla here, what they want to do is they want to can a painted image do some of the same things that these photographic and film images do, or at least be influenced by them? So here we see, just a dog and the feet of a woman walking the dog and the leash, and we see all of that movement, all of the different points in the movement of that plane, but all simultaneously. So the tail wags, and we see the tail in all of those points where it would be. The feet move, we see the points of all the feet. And that's sort of the point, is to try and take this approach of freezing movement and capturing time to really, that time ultimately is what's inspiring the futurists. What does a light look like? Now, normally when lights are rendered, they'll look like a glow, they'll look like the color, and but that's not capturing the movement of light. And that was another scientific advancement of the early 20th century, was the understanding of how light moves, and that it moves in waves, and that how light, and then trying to freeze that movement and what it would look like. This is his image of, well, what would it look like if we froze the movement of these waves of light as they emanated from this street light? It is an experimental style, Futurism and Dada. It's trying to do something that is suggestive and stylistic, but it's very abstract. Here Umberto Boccioni, he's trying to capture the movement of a figure in space. And he doesn't want to make it look realistic, and he's not trying at all to make this sculpted form resemble a human, but we want to still feel that connection. And I think that that's what's most important, is that they're not abandoning subject. They are just simply choosing style over the subject or over the realism. And sometimes this movements of the 20th century are labeled as deconstructionist. And basically what that means is that they were trying to break apart or deconstruct form and shape and the basic building blocks of art and style, and use those as a way to communicate something new. And that's ultimately what I think work people like Boccioni and Bala in the Futurists, they were trying to do, was to take it apart to understand it. Now, the Dadaists they're inspired by some of the same ideas, but they really look at, well, what is the nature of style? What is the nature of art and the role of the artist? I think it's an important question because, is the artist, if we see the artist as just someone who renders a subject, they're just the technique of the artist, not the idea, not the concept, then what will happen is that we'll focus just on that rather than on the more intellectual and conceptual role of the artist. And that's ultimately what the Dadaists were doing, is that they were looking at the role of the artist is conceptual first and technical second. And very often the technical isn't as important, at least in their mind. So here we have Marcel Duchamp, and Duchamp is the clear leader of the Dada movement, and he's one of the most interesting characters and artists in history. Duchamp believed that the role of an artist was to inspire through their ideas and creativity, not just through their technique. And very often he tried to make works that didn't use technique, or when they did use techniques, it was in a very different way than artists of the past had done. He just simply didn't want to rehash or redo what previous generations had done. So here he actually created a series of works he called his ready-mades. And what he did was, instead of taking materials and making art, he took objects and, with a minimum amount of technical work, he tried to recast those objects as something else than they were. And so what he ends up with is an object that is basically as he found it, but perhaps just sort of repositioned or changed or augmented in a way, or in this case, renamed. So here we have a male urinal, but it lays on its side, and he calls it a fountain. And then the idea kind of comes in and his concept comes in the way that he signs it. So he doesn't sign it Duchamp, but doesn't put his name on it. He puts R. Mutt, referencing a dog, so that a urinal is a fountain for a dog. And he lays it on its side so that we see it differently, we see its form differently. Now, there's a lot of debate, and has been for over 100 years now, about is this, or where does this fit in terms of the art world? Where does this approach to art fit in? Can art be purely conceptual, or does it have to be somewhat technical? Now, it's not that Duchamp's not capable of technique. He understands how to paint and how to sculpt. He's just not as focused on techniques. Or when he does use technique, he doesn't use them in the way that everyone else does. This is his most famous painting. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase. And what we end up with is a collection of an organization of lines and planes and shapes, and we can see a sort of a suggestion of movement, kind of like the Futurists, that all over movement, but it's not rendering. And Duchamp saw rendering as basically just mimicry, and really there was no need for that, because photography had changed the role of artists. So if you want to render something believably or realistically, you simply take a photograph, and photography was getting better and better in its quality and realism and its resolution at this point. So what Duchamp, I think, his legacy, what makes him so interesting is that what he's able to do is show that the conceptual, which had been sort of hidden behind the technical for so long, that the conceptual can be not only as important, but perhaps the only important element, that you don't have to have a high level of technique, that you can simply focus just on the idea, and the technique can facilitate that idea, but in a more simplistic way. All right, so we're going to look at the other elements of modernism and then the legacy of modernism in a future lecture.